Today on The Journey with Steve DeWitt.
What we find in this story is that God oftentimes works in subtle and mysterious ways. God works through weakness, human weakness and human frailty, and a message of foolishness, so that at the end of the day, there isn't anybody who can get the glory except for Him.
Welcome to The Journey. I'm your host, Tim Svoboda. What may seem like a setback can be an opportunity for God to accomplish His purposes. Today on The Journey, Pastor Steve DeWitt shows how God worked in a unique way through a man who was unable to use his right hand and brought peace to Israel. He'll also share why we should never underestimate God's deliverance. You can also find this message and other resources online at thejourney.fm. Here's Pastor Steve DeWitt with a message titled, Ehud, the Left-Handed Prophet.
Now, Ehud is not the first judge that is listed. It's actually Othniel in Judges 3. And I just want to very briefly take a look at Othniel, because Othniel serves as a kind of paradigm for all of the other judges that we find in this book. And so let me just read beginning in verse 7. It says this: the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. Remember, those were the gods of the Canaanites, the Baals and the Asherahs. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So Othniel serves as a kind of paradigm that we're going to see repeated again and again. It always begins with the people of God doing evil. We see that right here. They did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now let's just pause for a moment and recognize, why do they continually do evil in the eyes of the Lord? I mean, what's going on there? Why did they? And the answer is because they were sinners. By the way, it's the same reason that you and I, on a daily basis, struggle so much with doing exactly the same thing. If you were to chart us spiritually through the week, we all would have a similar chart, wouldn't we? We wake up with really good intentions, but it tends to be downhill from there, right? And then repenting and confessing, and then and that's the way that it goes. And we find that same pattern here. We sin because we're sinners. Now, as Christians, we have this new inclination towards doing righteousness, but we still have indwelling sin, don't we? And we struggle against the flesh, and we struggle against the world. And so we continually, like the Israelites, sin. We would also need to see in the paradigm that God's response to sin is always the same. We would like to think, in the world today, God's a God of love. God doesn't get angry with sin. God doesn't deal with sin. And yet we find in this passage, you can look for yourself, that God was angry with them. And so he brings distress to them. He brings trouble. Sin has consequences for them and for us. We never sin without consequences, always. Proverbs says it this way: the way of the transgressor is hard. Those friends that we have, those maybe brothers and sisters that decide to go off in a path of sin of some way, and they think this is going to make me happy, this is my life is going to be fulfilled. It doesn't happen that way. Sin has its own consequences. God has built that in, and he brings consequences to the people of God. He brings trouble to them. And so what does Israel do in response to the trouble? They cry out to God for help, just like you and I do. They cried out to God for help. And what does God do? God turns in compassion towards his people, and he sends them deliverance. And that's the story of Judges. It is the cycle of prosperity and the forgetting of God, the anger of God, the trouble God brings, the people turning in response, God sending a deliverer, and then winning the day. And we're going to see that pattern again and again as we work our way through this really fascinating book. So, the last thing I want you to see about Othniel is in verse 10. It says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him so that he was empowered to be Israel's judge. Now, we're not going to see that with every judge as we study them. But we need to understand that what the Holy Spirit is saying here is that these men were not superheroes. This Judges is not the story of extraordinary men doing extraordinary things. It is the story of ordinary men and one woman doing extraordinary things as God enables them to do it. So they are heroes in a sense, but they are heroes because of what God did through them, which I think is awful encouraging for very ordinary people like us, who sometimes wonder, can God do anything in my life? Can God use me in some extraordinary way? And the answer is, yes, he can. Yes, he can. He empowers his people to fulfill his will, and that's an extraordinary thing. So take heart, ordinary, common, normal people like us. Now, today we're going to study the second judge, and his name was Ehud. And I will tell you that is not an easy name to say, but Ehud has got to be one of the great stories in the entire Old Testament. And I'm pretty sure that when we get through this story, some of you are going to say, I never knew the Bible had stories like that in it, because this is really quite a story. And so let's get into it now as we begin the story of Ehud, verse 12. Once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. Getting the Ammonites and the Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. The Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. All right, stop there. So here's what's going on. Here we have this pattern again. Once again, after Othniel dies, the people of God do evil in the eyes of the Lord. What kind of evil was it? Worshiping the Baals, worshiping the Asherahs, joining themselves in the worship with the temple prostitutes, all the things that God hated about the Canaanite idolatry, the Israelites start doing it again. Why do they do that, by the way? Because they're sinners. And by the way, what are we too? Yeah, we're sinners. Let's just keep that in mind, okay? Keep that in mind. So, God once again brings trouble to them. He brings distress, and he brings the trouble this time in the form of the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Amalekites. And King Eglon is the king of the Moabites. And what he does is he brings these three nations together. And you might remember that the Moabites and the Ammonites are actually blood relatives of the Israelites. Those two nations came from Lot, Abraham's nephew, in a kind of nasty thing that happened after they fled from Sodom and Gomorrah. Those two nations came from the two daughters of Lot. So they're actually related to the Israelites, but they hate the Israelites. And the Amalekites are the first people that the Israelites do battle with once they have the exodus out of Egypt. And the Amalekites are the sworn enemies of the Israelites. So Eglon didn't have a tough job to do when he went around, sent envoys around saying, hey, let's go attack those stinking Israelites. They're like, oh, we hate the Israelites. And then the Amalekites said, we hate the Israelites too. And the Moabites said, you know what, we do too. Let's get them, okay? So they join forces and they come and they attack Israel. That now becomes this becomes their capital, if you will, for an occupation of Israel that lasted 18 years. In that day, to the winner went the spoils, and they could do whatever they wanted. And this 18-year oppression included all of the normal atrocities of the day, including the pillaging of the land, murder, raping of the women, the taking of wives, whatever they wanted. It was a terrible, terrible time. And if you and I lived there, you know what? We would be calling out to God too. Dear God, why? We're your people. How could you let this happen to us? Won't you please come and help us? And that's what they were doing. So, in fact, here's the text. This is what Israel does. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They cried out to God. And what did God do? It says next, and he gave them a deliverer. He gave them a deliverer. You know, we could stop right there, couldn't we, just for a moment and say, we learned something about God, don't we? When his people cried out to him, he brought deliverance. We're going to see that repeated again and again throughout the entire book. God's people cry out to him. God does not have a deaf ear to the needs of his people, but he extends compassion and mercy to them and meets their needs. And aren't we glad for that today? Amen? All right, now, Ehud is the deliverer. So let's talk about Ehud. It says that Ehud was a Benjamite. In fact, I didn't finish the phrase. Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera, the Benjamite. So here's what we find out about Ehud. He's a man. Secondly, he is a Benjamite, so he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Most important about Ehud, and this is the thing that everybody remembers about Ehud, is the physical description. It says that he was a left-handed man. Now, the Hebrew actually says this, that he was unable to use his right hand. He was unable to use his right hand. In other words, he was left-handed by default. And it doesn't say why he couldn't use his right hand. It could have been deformed. Maybe he didn't even have one. He might not even have had a right arm. We have no idea. All we know is that he had no ability to use his right hand. And this was a huge deal for a man in that culture because, you know, today we've got modern conveniences that allow people with various handicaps and things to have a very normal life. In that day, they didn't have any of that. And you know what a normal life entailed? You had to go farm. If you wanted to eat, you had to farm. It was an agricultural society. What can a one-armed man do when it comes to farming? Or what can a man who can't use his right hand do when it comes to actually, doing all the things entailed in farming the land? He can't do anything. The other thing you had to do as a man in that culture is you had to be able to fight. And you've seen pictures and all that with the sword in one hand, the shield in the other, and that's the way that they would do battle. If you don't have a right hand that works, you can't fight. So here we have Ehud, a man who in that culture is not capable of doing the things that manhood required. Nobody would look at Ehud and say, oh, look, there goes a soldier. Why? Because he didn't have a right hand. It's like I remember I was golfing at a local golf course, and as I was golfing, I look over, and here comes a guy, he's playing by himself, and he's got one arm. A one-armed golfer. Now, that's not something you see every day. And so I'm kind of playing, but I'm kind of keeping my eye on that guy as he's playing, and sure enough, he'd whack, and he would walk and hit, and he would whack, and he would play, and I'm told, somebody that knows him told me he plays there like all the time. He's a one-armed golfer. But if you were to look at him in the parking lot or see him at the mall, nobody would say, oh, look, there's a golfer. Why? Because he's only got one arm. In the same way, nobody looked at Ehud and said, oh, look, there's a soldier. Oh, look, there's a judge. There's a deliverer. He had no standing in that culture at all. Now, you could say that, but what we're going to find is that this is a story where not everything exactly meets the eye. There's all kinds of subtlety to the story, which is what makes it so fascinating. Okay, so let's get into it now. What happens? We begin in verse 15. The Israelites sent him, this is now Ehud, sent him with tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about 1.5 feet long. Okay, he's up to something. Are you with me in the story? This is classic storytelling here. Ehud the one-armed man is up to something. He makes a sword 1.5 feet long, and he straps it to his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was finish the sentence with me, very fat man. This is a fun story, I'm here to tell you. And that's the part that's made children giggle for centuries, was now, oh, he's got a sword, and the bad guy is a very fat man. Verse 18. After he had presented the tribute, he sent on their way the men who had carried it. At the idols near Gilgal, he himself turned back and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. Okay, now stop there. Here's what's going on. As the occupying army, Moab and King Eglon demanded tribute from the Israelites, like a tax. And of course, they're there, and he's just trying to make as much money as he possibly can off of the Israelites. He doesn't care about their needs. He's not improving their roadways. He's not helping with their waterways. There's no public funding of education. They're getting every dime they can out of the Israelites. That's what it meant to be under conquest. So Ehud now is chosen, not because somebody said, hey, this is the judge. Nobody knows this. He's chosen to be the one to take the tribute to Eglon. And there was a reason for that. The reason is that they didn't want Eglon to get any idea that they were maybe threatening him now. And what is the safest expression, the safest way to give tribute to the king than to send the one-armed man to do it? Nothing scary about Ehud. There's no danger with Ehud. He's only got one arm, for goodness sakes. This is kind of like a football team sending the water boy out for the coin toss, okay? They don't do that. What do football teams do? They send the biggest, baddest, ugliest, nastiest guys on the team. They send them out. Why? Because they want to send a message to the other team. We're going to take you out. Look how big our guys are, okay? The Israelites are doing the opposite of that. They're sending the safest, the most compliant, the most expression of their submissiveness to Eglon. They don't want him to get mad at them and increase the tax in any way. So let's send old Ehud, the one-armed guy, to go do it. Ehud now, acting apparently independently. This is not a nationwide conspiracy. He's acting on his own. It says that he made a sword that was a cubit. That's the word in the Hebrew, a cubit. And a cubit was the distance from the knuckle, if you clench your fist like this, the knuckle to the end of your elbow. That's a cubit, okay? So he makes a sword that's a cubit in length, roughly 18 inches. And it says that he tapes it to the inside of his thigh, his right thigh under his clothing. Now you say, now why would he do that? Here's why. Because he knew that when he showed up at Eglon's palace, that the Moabite secret service was going to pat him down. Nobody got into the presence of the king with weaponry, so that he was going to get patted down. And in that day, everybody fought with, they were right-handed, the way that God made people to be. I'm kidding, you left-handed people. I'm just kidding. All right. I know we have you here. We love you too. But they were all right-handed. And so when the Secret Service would pat them down, they would always, people that fight right-handed, you never watch the movies. They never, when they pull the sword out, they never go like this. They're always like this, right? And so right-handed people put their swords on the left side. And so he knew that. And so he puts it on the inside of his left thigh or his right thigh because they're not going to check that. Nobody would put a sword there after all. Nobody would hide something there. No. So this would allow him to get in to his presence with weaponry. Now, verse 17 adds the detail that makes this so much fun. Now, Eglon was a very fat man. After presenting the tribute to Eglon, Ehud and the other guys that were carrying the tribute, they head back home. They get back to Gilgal, and Ehud says, you guys go ahead. I'm going back. I got a secret message for the king. So he goes back to Jericho, and he tells the Secret Service, you tell the king, I have a secret message from God for him. Okay, now are you into the story with me? Because we know what he did, don't we? The whole taping of the sword on the inside. And so is he lying here? I think he maybe named the sword secret message myself. That's just a little theory that I have, kind of like Frodo, who had this sword. I can't remember its name. So I don't know. But he does have a little, and so you just kind of know that something big is about to happen. Here we go now. The picture you need to have in your mind is he's back at the palace, and we begin now in verse 19. The king said, "Quiet," and all his attendants left him. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his summer palace and said, "I have a message from God for you." As the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sunk in after the blade, which came out his back. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. It's in the Bible. This is the Bible I'm reading now. Then Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. They said, "He must be relieving himself in the inner room of the house." They waited to the point of embarrassment, but when he did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them. There they saw their Lord fallen to the floor, dead. Now there's a story in the Bible I'll bet many of you didn't even know was there. How's that for some details? Wasn't that fun? Oh, we're going to have a good time going through it now as well. So here's what happens. Ehud gets back to the palace, tells the Secret Service, tell him I got a secret message from God. They let him into his presence. Eglon says, "Quiet, you guys get out of here." So they all leave the room that he was in. There's Eglon on his throne. Here you have Ehud, the one-armed man, and he says, "I have a secret message for you." And you just kind of see him drawing closer to Eglon and saying that. And Eglon, maybe in respect now for, this word from God, he stands up, and Ehud gets close to him like this, and he goes, and then with his left hand, wham! And he sticks it in his belly. And apparently Eglon was so surprised by what happened that he couldn't even yell out for help, because those guys would have rushed in and taken out Ehud. He just dies, falls forward. And so Ehud now, he'd already had this plan. He goes over to the doors, he locks the doors, and escapes probably out some window, and he takes off running. Well, here you have the Secret Service. Then they break into the room and they find, here's their king dead. Okay, now here's what happened next, verse 26. While they waited, Ehud got away. He passed by the idols and escaped to Sarah. When he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. "Follow me," he ordered, "for the Lord has given Moab, your enemies, into your hands." So they followed him down, and taking possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab, they allowed no one to cross over. At that time, they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong. Not a man escaped. That day, Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years, the longest period of peace in the entire book of Judges.
You're listening to The Journey with Pastor Steve DeWitt, and part one of the message titled, Ehud, the Left-Handed Prophet. To hear the full message, visit thejourney.fm. We hope this message has encouraged you to trust God and turn to Him in whatever circumstances you face. Every day on The Journey, we proclaim the truth of God's Word by broadcasting biblically centered messages around the world. But as a listener-supported ministry, we need partners to come alongside us as we proclaim God's truth. Will you join us today by becoming a monthly partner with The Journey? Your faithful generosity allows us to continue sharing the good news of God's hope and love. To become a monthly partner, call 844-7-JOURNEY. That's 844-756-8763. Or give online at thejourney.fm. As a thank you for your gift, we'll send you a copy of the book Radical by David Platt. In a heartfelt and compelling narrative that includes real-life examples, Platt guides believers to take up their cross and follow Jesus. To request your copy today, call 844-7-JOURNEY or visit thejourney.fm. Well, I'm your host, Tim Svoboda. Join us again tomorrow as Pastor Steve DeWitt concludes this message, Ehud, the left-handed prophet. That's Friday on The Journey. The Bible teaching of Steve DeWitt is brought to you by The Journey.